your Universal hiking guide, Alaska Gold. The next adventure was a trip to Alaska. I was more than willing to walk away from the electronic equipment devices of the modern technological world and enter again into nature and the great outdoors. And great it was, as Alaska is twice the size of Texas, with only 2 million inhabitants. Every man, woman, and child would have 100 acres to themselves. At this point in my journey with Dwayne, everything I did was for the projects and for the self-sufficient communities to begin. It was not just for the adventure. It was to obtain capital for the benefit concerts that would be given to the world to help wake them up to what they are agreeing to. I know many people who are into their adventures and escapades, which is fine. But where does it lead? Combine adventure and becoming more aware, and it's a great formula for a real purposeful life. It was the middle of July when I took off on a flight from San Jose, California to Anchorage, Alaska. Tim took off from Grants Pass, Oregon, and we were to meet at the Anchorage airport to begin our adventure. After we connected in Anchorage, we took a shuttle to a cheap motel to get organized and plan for the supplies we would need for prospecting. Normally, I make it a habit to sleep outside since my Pacific Crest Trail hike, but sometimes return indoors for particular reasons such as this. Our list of supplies included a 4-wheel drive truck, 40 feet of 8-inch PVC pipe, 20 feet of 6-inch flex pipe, various camping equipment, and food for the 2 weeks we would be out in the bush. Tim's granddaughter, Kai Bear, helped us locate a 1995 Chevy 4-wheel truck on the Alaskan Craigslist. She talked the seller down to $1,000 from $1,400. We found out that money was going to be a little tight because of unexpected expenses. Suspicious of why the seller never turned off the truck when he drove in to make the deal, we soon found out after we turned it off and tried to restart it. Nothing. It needed a new battery. Add-ons such as that became the norm before we got out of Anchorage and headed north to the bush. The truck, surprisingly, did do the job, even though a few more problems with the carburetor and leaky rear brake seal did plague it. For $1,000, it was a good ride. The 40-foot of 8-inch PVC pipe was cheaper to ship by boat from Washington than to buy it locally in Alaska, where prices are generally a lot higher. We only needed 20 feet of 6-inch diameter flex pipe, but had to buy the entire 100-foot roll, another extra expense. We searched the thrift stores for camping gear such as pots and pans, sleeping bag, and pad for Tim, since most of Tim's baggage was mining equipment, like a sluice box, shovels, buckets, mining pan, classifier, etc. He did not want to spend extra money on personal baggage fees, so decided to pick those up in town. We were also able to pick up some free items, as many folks leave out freebies for the public in Alaska. The second night out, we camped 23 miles outside of Anchorage at a upper South Fork of Eagle Creek. Driving in, we saw a yellow ribbon stretching across the trailhead and a sign next to it, Brown Bear Maulings at end of Highland Road. 1 fatality, 1 serious injury. We took a chance and camped in the parking lot anyway, and had no visitors during the night. The next day, we drove back to town to pick up the PVC pipe at the dock. That too cost us more than what we were quoted. It was finally the last piece of equipment we needed, so we headed north up the Parks Highway to our destination, 150 miles away. We made a couple of stops along the way. One was at the house of the fellow who sold us the truck. He had forgot to throw in the spare tire, which was a good thing to have when out in the middle of nowhere, just in case we got a flat. He was in his garage dressing a huge moose he had hunted and brought back home. These are huge animals roaming Alaska and having plenty of meat on them. There is no limit to how many moose and bear you can hunt if you're living in a sustainable lifestyle in Alaska. The other stop was at Wasilla, where Sarah Palin was once the mayor, then went on to become governor and then vice presidential candidate and running mate with John McCain. We made it to a small town called Trapper Creek. Here we would turn off of the highway onto Petersville Road. Trapper Creek was a lodge with a gas station, store, laundry, showers, and a campsite. The owner, Tom Dooley, was a former fisherman on the Bering Sea. It's a rough ocean and many ships have been lost there. He retired and bought the lodge with his wife. When in his 50s, he and a buddy took snowmobiles with hitches and traveled from Willow to Nome, Alaska and back, a total of 1,100 miles. They did this through 60-mile-an-hour winds and temperatures down to 50 degrees below zero. Another character we met in Trapper Creek was the owner of the local trading post called Wall Mike's. Mike owns this world-famous collection of bear heads, moose crossing signs, old license plates, handmade local jewelry, dredging equipment, clothing, almost anything you can think of, he has for sale. Okay, we were ready for our trip into the wilds of Alaska. Let's get started down Petersville Road. After about 7 miles of pavement, the road turned to gravel for 13 miles. It was time to give the wheel over to Tim, as he knows this country well because he has been up here prospecting on several occasions. The next portion of the road was not really that, as it was a series of potholes, bumps, creeks, and ponds we had to cross. Part of the actual road was the creek as we rolled over rocks, smashing through brush and even over some large boulders. At one point, we had to get out of our $1,000 Chevy four-wheel truck and dismantle a beaver dam that was right in our way with no way around. It was unfortunate, but the beavers are very industrious and we knew they would build it back, and in some small way, they can contribute to our humanitarian cause. Finally, after about 26 miles since turning off the freeway, we came to Willow Creek in a small clearing off to the left. This was the campsite of an old miner named Jenkins who had done very well as the area was rich in gold. There's an interesting story and book about Jenkins and the area we were prospecting in. This is a summary from an Amazon book review of The Mystery of the Cache Creek Murders by Roberta Sheldon. Quote, in 1939, 4 brutal murders occurred at 3 separate locations on a single day in Cache Creek County, a remote Alaska gold mining region near Talkeetna. 2 of the victims, Dick Francis and Frank Jenkins, had mined there for almost 3 decades, but disputes over mining claims in the 1930s launched the 2 men into a protracted court battles and an arena of antagonism. By 1938, when Francis' claims were auctioned to satisfy court-ordered damages awarded to Jenkins, everyone in the scattered but close-knit mining community of Cache Creek County was aware of the bitter feud. At the end of the 1939 mining season, Jenkins and one of his young employees were bludgeoned to death in Wonder Gulch, 3 miles away. Helen Jenkins was murdered near the Jenkins's cabin along Little Willow Creek and in his Ruby Creek cabin. Francis was found shot in the head with a revolver in his hand in apparent suicide. He was thought to have first vengefully murdered the others, but an autopsy revealed that Dick Francis had been shot twice in the head. The shocked and outraged mining community began to suspect that Jenkins and Francis' feud had been ruthlessly exploited for caches of gold long rumored to be hidden on the Jenkins property. The case assumed sensational proportions in Alaska, and because law enforcement was minimal in this remote region, angry Alaskans clamored for a full-blown investigation by the FBI. More than 60 years later, the evidence never made public before whispers that justice may not have been served. Years passed as the mining claims owned by Jenkins and Francis expired, and they became part of the BLM land. Doing some research in the 1980s about the land claims in Willow Creek area, a fellow named Dennis Garrett discovered that lawyers had failed to renew the claims for the BLM, and the land was considered abandoned. Garrett immediately obtained mining rights to the area and started mining. He had 2 young adventuresome girls with him in their early 20s. During an exploration expedition, they came across an old abandoned cabin, and during the process it occurred to Garrett that this place might be the remnant of the Jenkinsons' Willow Creek cabin. He told the story of the murders of the 2 young gals, who then had an idea. They were intrigued by the idea that they might be on the site occupied by the murder victims, and proposed to seance to communicate with the Jenkinsons. Garrett recalls, "We sat on the floor in a circle around these candles and the girls had lit. They asked questions like, 'Who was the murderer? And where did you bury your gold?' No one answered. No one responded." Jenkins brought in large machinery and big diameter piping in order to move a lot of material. This would give him a better chance to locate gold. He did very well, and that's probably why he was targeted. Tim set up a large tent to sleep in and store our supplies. I set up my little one-man tent nearby. We had picked up a free table and purchased a couple of chairs, as this would aid in our comfort at camp. It is surprising how we take little things like this for granted, that when camping, these are luxuries. Work began the next day. We found a good spot 200 yards up the creek from the camp where there was a wide angle in the creek and also a bit of a fall, 1 foot for every 20 feet, where we could use the force of gravity. Here we constructed a dam 4 foot high built of large rocks and filled in the cracks with moss and mud. Then we stretched a roll of plastic over and in front of the dam to seal it. The purpose of the dam was to raise the level of the water so we could dredge more efficiently. A few feet of 8-inch PVC was placed through the lower part of the dam, and the remainder of the 40-foot pipe sloped down the other side of the dam into a sluice box at the end of the pipe. The sluice box is made to capture gold particles as they are sent through the pipe. They are a heavy metal, so will settle down into the grooves of the sluice box. Most days I would work the sluice box. This meant shoveling the gravel and rocks that came through the 8-inch PVC pipe to the side. Like mentioned before, the heavier gold particles would settle down into the bottom of the box. Tim would do the dredging. We had a 20-foot, 6-inch diameter flex pipe that was stuck a foot or so into the 8-inch PVC pipe on the dam side of our structure. This created a vacuum in which Tim was able to suck rocks and gravel from the bottom of the dam into the flex pipe, through the PVC, and into the sluice box at the other end. This process was a way to move through a large amount of material to find the gold. This method moves 100 times more material than panning. Tim would vacuum the top loose layer of the creek down to the bedrock because this is where the gold would fall and hide. In crevices, it would hide in veins. Tim's job was by far the most difficult, for he had to wear a wetsuit, gloves, and goggles in the 51-degree temperature water for hours as he was half submerged in the water. It would take a lot of bending and lifting the heavy flex hose full of water and gravel. He needed the goggles to see when he put his head under the water to scan the bottom. You hear stories of miners whose lower half of the body is freezing and the upper half is burning up in the sun. Fortunately, during our 2-week project, the temperature held into the 60-degree Fahrenheit scale with a few showers. Most days were cloudy, but when the sun did come out, it was very hot because of its angle to the earth up north. Most days we worked at least 6 hours on the dredge. Once you're set up, it's a matter of moving material through areas in the creek in order to find the gold. We did a few exploratory hikes to check out the headwaters of Willow Creek, do some testing, and generally get to know our surroundings. I hadn't been having a lot of dreams or real side experiences back home, but was able to remember a lot more of my activities on the real side living with nature. In one such experience, my 2 sons picked me up from the airport, and as we were driving home late at night, we saw a woman on the corner waving a sign that said, "Donate to cancer." We drove by, but she adamantly followed us and led us into a building with lots of people. One fellow came up to me in a confrontational way. I pushed him back, and as he took a few steps back, he showed me my wallet in his hands. He gave me back my wallet and tried to take it again, but this time I was paying attention and he couldn't get to it. I looked over to the head teacher and he said, "It doesn't always work." There can be many ways to interpret real side experiences. This one could have been a warning of cancerous relationships. Paying attention or your identity on the real side will be stolen away with tap lines or distortions. Tap lines are attachments, usually unconscious, that bind us to the worlds of creation. This experience also demonstrated how real guides, those beings that have a true awareness of life, like Rebizar Tars and Paul Twitchell, have to many times trick people into becoming more aware. They have a real challenge getting by the self-convinced attitudes of people. We would be a lot better off if we let life show us. Instead, we carry around attitudes, beliefs, ideas, and considerations that prevent us from seeing what life truly is. The person who took my wallet may have been a real guide, demonstrating to me I need to pay attention. There can be many viewpoints on how to see these real side experiences. After a week in the bush, we decided to go into town for food, gas, and other supplies. The gas tank on the Chevy showed a quarter of a tank left, but then suddenly showed empty as the gas gauge had a mind of its own. It was 40 miles back into Trapper Creek, and it didn't look good. We coasted on downhill stretches, and on the last downhill before we ran out of gas, we coasted right into the little town of Petersville, which is 20 miles from Trapper Creek, which had a gas station. Petersville has a population of 4. When Tim last visited many years ago, the town only had 1 resident, a caretaker for Michelle Stevens, who owns 143 mining claims in the area. We knocked on the old shack, and a bare-chested, barefooted old-timer came to the door to greet us. He introduces himself as Robert E. Lee. This place would be a great hideout if you wanted to change your name and hide from the law. Anyway, we bought 5 gallons of gas from Robert and made it back into town. The little town of Talkeetna was only 15 miles, so after we resupplied, we decided to see this famous tourist attraction. The 2 to 3 blocks of downtown area are filled with souvenir shops selling Alaskan crafts and a number of unique food establishments. but its most famous claim is for the transporting climbers who want to make an attempt at scaling the 20,000-foot Mount Denali, or Mount McKinley. Talkeetna sits at the junction of three rivers that join to form the Big Sioux River, which is a massive and very cold. Bush planes with sleds take climbers from here and lift them to the base of Mount Denali. After our excursion, we drove back to camp at Willow Creek for another week of prospecting. I will keep the amount of gold we found a mystery. Maybe later it will be revealed. It was, after all, why we came to Alaska. Funding for our humanitarian projects is just the beginning. There are more surprises ahead of even greater importance than obtaining funds. There have been those that hit a gold vein and were able to retire comfortably. This is a try and an adventure we had to attempt. We had our share of visitors to the camp. One night, a large moose and a scrubby little porcupine came by. Regular visitors for breakfast and dinner were a prairie dog and her three babies, and a mama and Papa Bird with one of their young. It was so much more fun watching them than watching TV at home. The mosquitoes and biting deer flies were constant except when the wind came up or it got to be a little colder. I wore a head net and Tim used insect repellent on his exposed parts to make us more comfortable as we worked. This was tundra country with many alder bushes. They never reach tree height because the snow levels cover the plants for most of the year. We were only up about 3,000 to 4,000 feet, but it was an alpine environment because we were so far north. Again, we used hints and clues from our seer Claudie. She had helped us on Buck's Mountain with certain insights she gleaned from the real side, and she would be along with us remotely on this one. The real guides could lead us to the gold if they wanted to, but the idea is we learn to do it for ourselves. They let us go through most of the experiences and learning we need to become like one of them. Anybody can do it, as Dwayne says, but it takes the long haul with no attitudes and keeping one's personal self in check. We would drive up to the top of a nearby mountain to get a signal every couple of days to listen to the messages she had left. We asked her to put some attention on finding the gold. One of her visions was that of the gold being buried under a tree. There was only one tree for miles around us, as most of the area was tundra. When I left to go back home, Tim stayed 4 or 5 days more until the weather turned to rain. During this time, he dug and dug and dug around the tree for several feet, but nothing showed up. Like I mentioned, I went back before Tim. His son and grandson met us at Anchorage after we made the drive back to the city. From there, I took a flight home, and Tim spent some time with his family, after which he drove back to Willow Creek for some solo prospecting. It's a matter of doing. To be continued.